Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was just past midnight when I boarded the train, the station dimly lit, nearly deserted, except for the occasional flicker of the overhead lamps. I had taken this route countless times, the late-night trains usually empty or nearly so, allowing me to ride in peace, lost in my thoughts. That night, the air was thick with the faint scent of rain from earlier, mixed with the unmistakable metallic tinks of the rails. I carried a small backpack, my coat pulled tight against a cold that seemed sharper than usual, a wind creeping along the platform and stirring loose debris. I stepped onto the train and was immediately struck by the stillness. The carriage was empty. Not just sparsely occupied, completely empty. I chose a seat near the middle, facing the sliding doors, and settled in, listening to the faint hum of the train waiting to depart. The soft click of doors closing echoed through the carriage, leaving only the rhythmic whir of the wheels beginning to roll along the tracks. The outside world blurred past the windows, shadows stretching and folding over the darkness beyond. I exhaled slowly, enjoying the solitude, the gentle vibration under my feet, the quiet rhythm of a familiar journey. Minutes passed, and the train carried me forward through the tunnels that punctuated this route. Normally, the occasional distant chatter or the scrape of a conductor's cart would break the monotony, but that night there was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, only the faint, steady hum of the train, and the occasional drip of water from somewhere high above, echoing in the metal space. The darkness outside the windows pressed in, turning the empty station platforms into shapes and angles that seemed almost wrong, as if the world beyond the glass had been rearranged while I wasn't looking. I leaned back in my seat, adjusting my scarf, and glanced around. The empty carriage felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just quiet, it felt watched. I could feel the weight of absence in every corner, a tension that made my skin crawl. My heart beat steadily, but the sensation of being alone was growing oppressive, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. The lights above me flickered, once, softly, like a slow pulse, then steadied. A subtle draft of cold air brushed my cheek, though the windows were sealed, and I shivered despite myself. I tried to focus on something mundane, the small hum of the train, the sound of the wheels along the rails, even the faint vibration of the seat beneath me. But then I noticed its movement. At first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't align with the curves of the seats or the window reflections. I turned slowly, but the carriage remained empty. Still, I felt it, a presence impossible to locate, like a weight pressing softly behind my shoulder, just out of reach. My pulse quickened slightly, but I forced myself to breathe calmly, telling myself it was imagination, tired eyes, the tricks of light and shadow. The train curved into a long, dimly lit tunnel, the glow from outside disappearing entirely. My reflection stared back at me from the window, pale and indistinct, framed by the faint light of the carriage lamps. I shifted in my seat, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw another figure. Just behind me, blurred and shifting in the glass. I blinked, and it was gone. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was a trick of the reflection, perhaps the faint ripple of condensation on the glass. but the feeling of being observed remained, tightening like a coil in my chest. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The carriage plunged into complete darkness. The hum of the train continued, mechanical and steady, but every other sound, the distant screech of brakes, the faint clatter of another train in a parallel tunnel, even my own breathing was absorbed into the blackness. I froze, the sudden absence of light making the empty train feel impossibly vast, like a hollowed-out tunnel suspended in an infinite void. My hands gripped the edges of the seat, searching for something to hold on to, anything to anchor me. It was then that I heard it. Not a voice, not words, but the faintest shuffle, like the brushing of fabric against metal. Somewhere in the darkness, movement had begun. I strained my eyes, but the windows reflected only black, and the faint glow of emergency lights had yet to flicker on. The sound drew closer, deliberate and slow, weaving between the seats, yet I could see nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo through the empty carriage. I told myself to stay calm, to reason it out. Maybe a maintenance worker had boarded, a phantom silhouette cast by my imagination, but instinct screamed otherwise. Every fiber of my being insisted that I was no longer alone. And then, almost imperceptibly, I felt it. The faint brush of air against my neck. The whisper of movement so close, I could have sworn someone had leaned over me. I froze completely, afraid to turn, afraid to even breathe. The train continued to move, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against rails now seeming louder, almost magnified. Shadows began to coalesce, or at least my mind interpreted them that way, dark shapes sliding between the seats. Impossible in their timing, flickering in the darkness as though the carriage itself had warped. My reflection in the glass was no longer my own. The face staring back seemed faintly distorted, with eyes too dark, too still, too knowing. And yet, I was still Mior, at least I thought I was. Minutes, or was it hours, passed in a slow, unbearable tension, and every sound became magnified. The scraping of metal against metal, the faint hum of the ventilation, a distant drip of water echoing endlessly through the dark carriage. And then I noticed the footsteps, rhythmic now, pacing beside me, circling, never approaching fully, never receding. The air seemed to grow colder, denser, pressing in from all directions, and I realized that I couldn't tell which way was forward, which way was back. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back on. The carriage was empty once again. My hands trembled, my chest heaving, and I leaned back against the seat, trying to convince myself I had imagined the entire ordeal. The windows reflected only me, pale and shaken, nothing more. I rode the rest of the journey in silence, the hum of the train somehow heavier now, every shadow suspicious, every sound a potential echo of the unseen. When I finally stepped onto the platform at my stop, the station lights glowing warmly, the world felt unnervingly bright, to normal, too sharp. I glanced back, half expecting the darkness to follow, to emerge from the next train waiting silently on another track, but nothing came. Even now, I avoid the late-night trains, yet whenever I hear the hum of rails at night, or catch a glimpse of an empty carriage through fogged windows, I feel it, the unmistakable sensation that I am not truly alone, that something waits in the darkness, patient, silent, and always just behind me. The lights may return, the shadows may fade, but I know that the next time the train plunges into darkness, I will not be the only passenger. It was a rainy evening when I decided to take the bus home. The sky had been gray all day, and now, as the clouds broke into a fine drizzle, the city streets glistened with reflections of neon signs and streetlights. The rhythmic patter of rain against the windows of the bus shelter sounded almost like a lullaby, steady and calming, masking the faint hum of distant traffic. One had taken this route countless times, and normally, the bus was quiet at this hour, occupied only by a few scattered passengers, people lost in their phones or staring out the wet windows. I stepped onto the bus and found an empty seat near the middle. The warmth of the interior was comforting, a small bubble against the damp chill outside. I settled in, pulling my coat tighter and letting the gentle sway of the bus soothe me. I noticed the usual patterns: the quiet sigh of the engine, the soft squeak of the brakes, the faint murmur of the air vents above. For a moment, everything felt ordinary, peaceful even, but there was an underlying stillness, a subtle absence, that made me aware of every creak and shuffle as though they were louder than they should be. As the bus pulled away from the stop, I glanced around. Empty seats stretched behind me, the dim overhead lights casting long shadows along the floor. That's when I sensed an awareness that I was not as alone as I had thought, at first. I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps someone had entered quietly, taking a seat behind me while I was distracted. I turned slightly, peeking over my shoulder, but the seat directly behind me was empty. I relaxed again, convincing myself it was my imagination, a trick of tired eyes in the dim light. The bus hummed along, the rhythmic motion lulling me into a trance-like state. The rain streaked the windows in long diagonal patterns, reflecting the orange glow of streetlights. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze. The word was soft, drawn out, chillingly familiar. My name. I dared a slow glance over my shoulder. There was no one there. The seat was empty. My pulse quickened, but I tried to tell myself it was just the sound of the wind, the bus settling into its creaking rhythm, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I turned back to the window, forcing my thoughts onto the passing cityscape, the blurred lights smeared by rain. But the whisper came again, closer this time, unmistakable, and unmistakably my name. I stiffened, unable to look back immediately. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. The sound was soft but deliberate, intimate, as though someone were sitting right behind me, leaning in to speak. And yet, when I summoned the courage to turn, the seat remained empty. The overhead lights flickered briefly, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to shift, stretching along the floor and wrapping around the contours of the seats. I felt the weight of eyes on me, unseen but tangible, pressing from just behind. The bus slowed at a stop, and I glanced out the windows. Few people moved in the drizzle, some hurrying along with umbrellas, some waiting silently at bus shelters. Nothing unusual, no one who could have whispered my name, no one following me. But when the bus doors hissed closed and the vehicle resumed its journey, I felt it again, a presence, a warmth or closeness that shouldn't exist in an empty seat, a shadow that lingered just beyond vision. I gripped the edge of my seat, heart hammering. The whisper came again, quieter now, almost a sigh, dragging my name across the space between us. I tried speaking aloud, asking if anyone was there, my voice small, uncertain. No response, just the steady hum of the bus and the soft patter of rain against the windows. And yet, the feeling of being watched remained. A pressure along my spine, as if the unseen passenger were inching closer without ever making a sound. I turned fully to face the empty row behind me, expecting, hoping, praying to see nothing. The seat was indeed empty. A faint chill crept along my neck, and I pulled my coat tighter, telling myself to breathe, to remain calm. But the whisper came again, this time distinct and drawn out, a soft exhalation that seemed to linger in the air long after it had been spoken. My name, repeated, with a cadence that no one else could possibly know. The bus swayed around. A corner, the lights flickering in a slow rhythm, casting shadows that seemed almost human across the seats. Every few moments, I thought I glimpsed movement, a brief shape in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned fully, there was nothing. I tried rationalizing it, reflections, shifting shadows, tired eyes, yet, deep inside, I knew it was something else, something patient, unseen, waiting. Minutes dragged on. The whisper would come and go, never continuous, always timed to the quiet moments. When my attention waned, when my guard was down, I dared not make sudden movements, fearing that doing so might provoke whatever lingered behind me. I could feel it, a soft pressure, a near touch, always just beyond reach, a presence that existed without form but with intent. Eventually, the bus approached my stop. I stood slowly, trying not to glance behind me, trying to ignore the weight of unseen eyes. The whispering ceased just as I moved toward the doors, replaced by the gentle creak of the bus braking and the hiss of the doors sliding open. Outside, the rain had intensified, the streetlights reflecting in puddles that seemed to stretch endlessly. I stepped onto the wet pavement, turned to board the sidewalk, and forced myself to walk briskly home. Even now, I avoid that bus at night. I can't explain why the seat behind me always feels warm, as if someone is sitting there, just out of sight. And sometimes, when the rain taps against my window, or the hum of the train blends into the city at night, I swear I hear a soft, deliberate whisper, my name, just behind me, even though I am alone. It started late one evening, when the streets were slick with the remnants of a recent rain. I had missed the last train, and taxis were my only option. The city seemed quieter than usual, the usual hum of traffic reduced to distant echoes bouncing between the wet walls of alleyways and office buildings. I waved down the first cab I saw, its headlights cutting through the damp mist like twin lanterns guiding me to safety. The driver nodded without speaking as I climbed in, the interior smelling faintly of old leather and something else I couldn't place a scent, like dust and rain mixed together. I gave him the address, my apartment a little over 30 minutes away by car. The meter clicked steadily, a soft, comforting rhythm as we pulled away from the curb. But soon, I noticed something was off. The streets we drove through were unfamiliar, narrow, and lined with buildings that didn't appear on any map I had seen. Shop signs flickered with strange symbols, half-faded letters that my mind tried to decipher and failed. Even the familiar landmarks dissolved behind us, replaced by stretches of streets that looked like they had been forgotten by time. I mentioned this to the driver, half joking, half concerned. He didn't answer, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The cab's interior felt tighter now, almost oppressive, and the rain outside seemed heavier, pressing against the windows, tapping out irregular patterns that made my skin crawl. I leaned back, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself I was overthinking that cities sometimes had back roads and alleys I didn't know. But something about the way he drove smooth, unhurried, almost too precise felt deliberate. The streets twisted in ways that defied logic. We passed buildings with doors that led nowhere, windows showing rooms filled with shadows that moved against the angle of light. Street lamps flickered but did not illuminate the road fully, casting strange, wavering patterns across the pavement. I could feel my pulse quickening, the sense of being watched growing heavier with every turn, and yet the driver didn't speak. Not a word, not even a glance at me in the rearview mirror. I tried to look out the side window, but the scenery was blurred, distorted by the rain and something else I couldn't explain. Signs shifted as we passed, letters rearranging themselves, shapes bending subtly, as if the city itself were breathing and moving around us. My stomach twisted. I realized I didn't recognize any of this, but it didn't feel entirely new either. It was familiar in a way that was unsettling, like seeing a memory slightly warped, wrong, yet recognizable. I asked the driver again where we were, my voice tense now. Still no answer. The hum of the engine filled the silence, almost mocking. Me, steady and mechanical, but the world outside was anything but steady. Shadows twisted in corners, dark shapes flitting at the edges of my vision. Occasionally, I thought I saw people standing perfectly still in the rain, their faces hidden beneath umbrellas, their bodies angled oddly, as if they were leaning in impossible directions. When I blinked, they were gone. We passed a street that seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with buildings that had no doors or windows. A dense fog began to seep along the road, curling around the cab, muffling the sound of the rain. The meter was still ticking, but the numbers seemed irrelevant, meaningless in this place that had no coordinate on any map. I asked the driver to turn around, to go back, and for the first time, he spoke. Not words, but a low, breathy hum, vibrating through the cab. The sound was unnerving, a note too low for the human voice, yet undeniably coming from him. I leaned forward, gripping the edges of the seat. The cab moved onward, unbothered by my panic, the mist swallowing the world outside. I could see my reflection in the rearview mirror, pale and anxious, but behind it, something else flickered in indistinct shape that shouldn't be there. I blinked. It was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, that stress and exhaustion were conjuring things, but the feeling persisted. Hours are what felt like hours passed in this distorted labyrinth. We drove under bridges that twisted into impossible angles, past buildings that seemed alive, walls pulsating faintly as though breathing. Sometimes I caught glimpses of other cars, but they were empty, or their drivers were mere shadows, staring straight ahead, with faces too blank to be human. The rain never let up, the drops streaking the windows into sheets of liquid silver, reflecting lights that had no source. I asked the driver where we were one final time, my voice trembling. This time, he did look at me, briefly, and I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't explain. They were too dark to knowing a depth that suggested he had been waiting for me to notice, for me to realize I was no longer in any place I had known. And then he said something, in a tone so soft I could barely hear it. "You are here now." The cab slowed to a stop. I looked out, and the city was gone. There was no street, no rain, no lights, only a gray expanse stretching endlessly, punctuated by shadows that seemed to watch, and a faint shimmer in the distance that suggested something might exist there, something I didn't want to see. The meter was still running, ticking upward, counting a fare I could never pay in a city that didn't exist. I stumbled out of the cab, my feet sinking slightly into the gray nothingness, and turned to find the driver. The seat was empty. The cab had vanished, as though it had never been there, leaving only the faint echo of its engine and the low hum that seemed to linger in my ears. I called out, but there was no response. My name felt wrong on my lips, strange in a world that wasn't mine. Now, whenever I see a taxi waiting at the curb, I hesitate. I tell myself it's just a car, just a ride home. But in the corner of my vision, I sometimes think I see the shape of a cab that shouldn't exist, with headlights cutting through a fog no one else can see. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet, I swear I hear the soft, deliberate hum of an engine, and the faintest whisper, promising a ride to somewhere that's not on any map. It was late, much later than I usually stayed out. The streets had emptied gradually, leaving only the occasional car humming past and the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the night. I had just finished visiting a friend who lived across town, and I was glad when I saw the bus approaching the stop. Its headlights glimmered through the damp air, the streets still wet from the afternoon drizzle. I stepped forward, pressing my umbrella against the wind, grateful for the familiar comfort of routine. The bus hissed as it slowed to the stop, its doors sliding open with a familiar squeak. I climbed aboard and moved to my usual seat near the middle. The interior was quiet, more so than I expected at that hour. Only a few scattered passengers were on board, each absorbed in their own thoughts or scrolling through their phones. The warmth inside the bus was comforting, a stark contrast to the crisp night air outside, and I leaned back, letting my shoulders relax as the bus pulled away. Minutes passed uneventfully. I watched the blurred lights of buildings streak past the windows, raindrops tracing uneven lines down the glass. The bus followed its usual route, stopping briefly at familiar corners where no one got on or off. Then, as the vehicle curved along a long stretch of road, I realized I needed to get off soon. My stop was approaching. I pressed the button, the little red light illuminating with a soft glow, and waited for the usual hiss of brakes, the subtle lurch as the bus slowed. But it didn't happen. At first, I thought maybe the driver hadn't seen the light, or that the stop was slightly ahead. I pressed the button again, a little harder this time, and even called out, politely, for the bus to stop. The interior remained still. The few passengers glanced briefly, then went back to their screens, or stared silently ahead. The bus continued its route, unwavering, passing streets I knew well, but the feeling of unease began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, telling myself perhaps there was a detour, or the driver was new, or I was imagining things, but every familiar landmark I anticipated seeing slipped past unnoticed. The bus glided silently, almost too smoothly, as though it had no intention of stopping anywhere at all. The rhythmic hum of the engine was no longer comforting. It was hypnotic, monotone, and unyielding. I stood, moving toward the front of the bus, hoping to speak directly to the driver. As I approached, I noticed the rearview mirror. The driver's face was there, pale and calm, eyes forward, expression unchanged. I tried to catch his attention, waving, calling, but he did not turn. And then I realized something else. The streets outside had begun to change. The familiar cityscape blurred into unfamiliar buildings. Some crooked, some impossibly tall, with windows that reflected nothing but darkness. The rain outside had stopped, but the pavement gleamed as if still wet, and shadows moved along the walls in ways that made no sense. I called out again. The few passengers remained silent, motionless, some staring straight ahead with blank expressions, others with faces just out of focus, blurred as if they were melting into the interior. I returned to my seat, heart hammering, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps this was a new route I had never taken, or maybe I had misremembered the streets. But deep inside, I knew that the bus was no longer following a route I recognized. Minutes, maybe hours passed. The bus continued its silent journey, stopping at places that were not stops, passing empty streets with no lights, no signs, no indication of life. I pressed the stop button repeatedly, my knuckles white, and each time nothing happened. The engine's hum became louder in my ears, blending with the soft mechanical hiss of the ventilation system, a sound that now seemed almost alive. Tried speaking to the other passengers, asking if anyone else's stop was approaching, but no one answered. They were all there, present, yet untouchable, like mannequins frozen in motion. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. And then I noticed the reflection in the window beside my seat. It wasn't just my reflection. A faint, indistinct shape hovered behind me in the glass, moving slightly when I did not. I turned sharply, and the seat was empty. When I looked back at the window, the shape was gone. I told myself I was tired, that shadows played tricks on weary eyes. Yet the feeling persisted, an almost tangible presence, hovering, observing. I moved to the front again, trying to open the door manually, only to find the handle unyielding, fixed in place. Panic rose like a wave, sharp and cold, filling my chest. The bus continued. The outside world had become a continuous gray void, neither day nor night, with vague shapes at the edges of perception, figures I could not define, buildings I could not name. My voice was swallowed by the interior, my words meaningless. I sank to the floor near the front, gripping the edge of a seat. The bus moved on, unrelenting. The red stop button glowed, useless, a mockery of control. Every time I tried to rationalize, every time I convinced myself I must be dreaming or hallucinating, the whispers started, soft at first, barely audible, carried on the hum of the engine. My name, my voice. The whispers came from behind, yet there was no one there. I could feel the presence, pressing closer, a weight in the air that made breathing difficult. Time lost meaning. I do not know how long I sat there, trembling, listening to the low, continuous vibration of the engine and the rain-slick hum of something beyond understanding. The shadows in the corners of the bus seemed to pulse with each breath I took, stretching, taut, and shifting when I blinked. I could see shapes, hints of faces, impossible angles of arms and torsos moving in silent, distorted imitation of life. Eventually, the bus slowed slightly, the hum becoming a low, vibrating tone that filled the interior. I approached the driver one last time, my voice shaking uncontrollably, but the seat was empty. The wheel turned on its own, the engine running smoothly, obediently, taking me forward into the gray unknown. The passengers remained frozen, blank, expressions unreadable, and the stop button, glowing softly, seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. Entirely useless, entirely real. I do not remember how I left the bus that night. When I woke the next morning, I was standing on a street I recognized, the rain lightly falling, the city around me normal. The bus stop was empty. My shoes were wet. I carried no memory of climbing out, of stepping into familiar streets, only a lingering sense of displacement, of something hovering just behind me, waiting, reminding me that control had been an illusion, that a ride I thought I could stop had its own will. Sometimes, when I hear the hum of a bus engine at night, or the soft patter of rain on city streets, I think of that ride. I think of the glowing stop button, and I wonder what would have happened if I had pressed it just one more time, if the bus had stopped. Because that night, I learned that some journeys are not ours to end, and some rides will take you somewhere that exists outside the map of the world you know. It was late in the evening when I decided to take the bus home, a route I had taken countless times before. The city streets were quiet, softened by a thin layer of mist that rose from the damp asphalt, remnants of a rain that had stopped hours ago. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows that made familiar corners feel strange and alien. I settled into my seat by the window, the warmth inside the bus a comforting barrier against the cool night air outside. Most of the seats were empty, and only a few passengers lingered, their faces obscured by shadows or hoods. The bus hummed gently as it moved along its route, the tires whispering over the wet streets. I stared out at the cityscape, letting the rhythmic motion lull my mind into a calm, almost dreamlike state. It was quiet, peaceful even, until I noticed her. She stepped onto the bus at one of the previous stops. I hadn't seen her get on, and yet there she was, sitting a few rows behind me. She wore a long coat, dark and unremarkable, but something about the way she held herself drew my attention. She didn't make a sound, didn't look around. She simply watched, her gaze fixed, somewhere beyond the bus, or perhaps into nothing at all. There was nothing alarming about her at first, just an odd stillness that made the hairs on my arms prickle. The bus continued along its familiar path, passing streets I knew intimately. I occasionally glanced back, and each time she was there, seated exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her eyes always staring, a chill ran down my spine. There was no one else like her on the bus, no movement, no whispers, just the soft hum of the engine and the faint patter of condensation sliding down the windows. My stop was approaching, and I prepared to press the button. But as I did, she moved. Not toward the front, not to get off at another stop. She simply slid quietly from the row behind me, walking with a fluid, almost gliding motion toward the rear of the bus. My pulse quickened, though I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the shadows, a reflection in the window, perhaps my imagination. When the bus finally slowed to a stop, I noticed where she got off. The lights outside illuminated a sign I had passed 100 times before: cemetery stop. The irony, or perhaps the coincidence, made me hesitate. She stepped off the bus and paused, standing still on the wet asphalt. The fog curled around her like it knew her, curling, twisting, almost protective. Her gaze shifted subtly, finally meeting mine through the window, and in that brief moment, I felt a pull in my chest, a gravity that made my heart ache. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing. People sometimes ride the bus to the cemetery, for late visits or errands, but something in the way she stood, motionless in the mist, waiting, as though she had been expecting me all along, routed me to the seat. The bus doors closed, and I felt a shiver of unease as the vehicle pulled away, taking me past familiar streets that now seemed unfamiliar, distorted in the dim light. I pressed the stop button for my own destination, but the world outside didn't look right anymore. Buildings loomed taller than they should have, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the mist thickened in corners where it shouldn't exist. My reflection appeared in the window beside me, pale and anxious, and for a moment, I could swear I saw her standing behind me there too, silent, waiting, watching. I spun around, but the seat was empty. The empty rows echoed my heartbeat, louder than the hum of the tires. The bus carried on, and I kept glancing toward the rear, half expecting to see her materialize in the shadows. Nothing, and yet, a small, almost imperceptible movement in the fog outside the window caught my eye. For a fleeting second, I thought, I saw the shape of a figure following the bus on the damp asphalt, gliding silently, keeping pace with the motion as though tethered to me in some inexplicable way. My stomach churned, but I told myself it was a trick of the light, a reflection, or maybe a passerby cloaked in the mist. The streets seemed to stretch on longer than they should have, familiar turns bypassed as though the bus itself had grown sentient, guiding me somewhere unknown. My anxiety rose steadily, the quiet hum of the engine now oppressive, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. I tried speaking, calling out to anyone on the bus, but the few passengers remained still, expressionless, staring forward as though hypnotized. No one answered. Hours or what felt like hours passed in a distorted rhythm of lights, shadows, and the soft tapping of rain or condensation against the windows. Occasionally, I would catch the faint reflection of her face, pale and unreadable, lingering in the glass. Every time I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the memory of her gaze, unyielding and expectant. Eventually, the bus slowed to my stop. I hesitated, my hand frozen above the button, half afraid to step out. And then I saw her again, just beyond the mist, standing perfectly still at the cemetery stop. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I felt an impossible gravity, a pull toward her that made me shiver uncontrollably. I stepped off the bus, my feet wet from the fog that clung to the streets. She didn't move, She simply waited. I wanted to walk past, to ignore her, to tell myself it was a coincidence, but the pull lingered, and my legs trembled despite my efforts. When I turned my back, unsure of what to do, the mist thickened behind me, curling, pressing, almost alive. The world felt unreal, the boundary between reality and something else fraying. I ran the rest of the way home, glancing back only once. She was still there, standing at the cemetery stop, waiting, silent and patient, as though she had been there for hours, days, maybe longer, always waiting for me. I made it inside, locking the door behind me, but the sensation of being watched persisted. At night, when the streets are wet and the fog curls low, I think of her still, standing there, waiting. Sometimes, when the bus passes my street late, at night, I swear I see her in the rearview mirror of the last passenger seat, watching, patient, and still waiting, and I wonder if she always will. Q. It was a late evening when I found myself alone in the elevator of my apartment building. The lobby had been empty when I walked in, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly, casting long shadows along the walls. Rain had started falling outside, soft at first, then heavier, tapping against the large glass windows with a rhythm that made the silence inside feel heavier, almost oppressive. See. I pressed the button for my floor and stepped inside, the metal doors sliding shut with a muted hiss that sounded unusually final in the empty space. The elevator smelled faintly of antiseptic and polished metal, a clean but sterile scent that made the quietness even more noticeable. I pressed my palm against the wall as the elevator began its slow ascent, listening to the gentle whir of the motor and the tiny creaks of cables adjusting tension. Normally, I would take these rides for granted, lost in thought or scrolling through my phone, but tonight the stillness seemed to press against me, and the shadows in the corners of the elevator felt thicker, as if they had weight. I noticed then the faint reflection in the polished metal walls. At first, it seemed normal. I saw myself, framed slightly off-center by the elevator's interior, but as the seconds passed, I felt the uncanny sense that something was off. The reflection didn't move exactly as I did. I lifted my hand, and the image seemed just a fraction behind me, slower, hesitant, almost observing. My heart began to race, a faint thrill of unease creeping up my spine. I blinked and shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Poor lighting, fatigue, the stress of the day, but the sensation lingered. The elevator chimed as it passed the mid-level floors, but the doors didn't open. Usually, someone would enter or exit at these hours. Sometimes, a neighbor returning from work or a visitor leaving late. But the car remained empty, silent, save for the soft mechanical hum of the motor. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the brushing of fabric or the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I froze, gripping the handrail, straining my ears. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving only the low vibration of the elevator cables. I told myself it was impossible. I was alone. The building was quiet, the lobby empty when I left, but the unease wouldn't leave. My reflection continued to feel wrong. There were moments when I glanced sideways, certain that something would be just out of frame, and my reflection would twitch, a movement that I had not made. a hesitation in its gaze that suggested it was aware of me in ways I could not understand. The elevator reached my floor. The doors opened with the usual metallic sigh, and I stepped out, trying to shake the lingering unease. The corridor was deserted, dimly lit, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the distant sound of the rain. I walked briskly to my apartment, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. I told myself to breathe, to calm down, but the thought persisted. What had I really seen in that reflection? Something in the corner of my eye had felt wrong. Later that night, curiosity gnawed at me. I live in a building with a small security system, the cameras overlooking the lobby and elevators, usually used to monitor deliveries or check who came in at odd hours. I hesitated before opening the live feed for the elevator, half afraid of confirming what I already feared. The screen flickered as the feed loaded, and there it was. The elevator empty, or so it seemed at first glance. Quote, I pressed play on the recorded footage from earlier. My own entrance, the pressing of the floor button, the elevator beginning its ascent all normal. But as the recording progressed, I noticed something I had not felt in real time. Behind me, in the camera, in the reflection on the elevator's metal walls, there was a figure. I hadn't seen it with my eyes in the moment, but it was there in the reflection. Tall, indistinct, featureless, moving slightly behind me, just enough to suggest presence. And yet, in the actual elevator footage, the seats, the handrails, the empty air, there was nothing. I leaned closer to the monitor, heart pounding, and the figure shifted in the reflection, tilting its head as if observing me, attentive, patient, and entirely deliberate. It mimicked my movements only slightly, second or two delayed, but never fully aligned. I felt my stomach twist with a cold dread. My mind struggled to reconcile what I saw on the screen with what I had believed, that I was alone. The elevator had reached the upper floors on the footage. I had pressed my floor button. The figure remained behind me, still in the reflection. Patient, waiting. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. It raised a hand, or something like a hand, and mimicked the motion of pressing a button on the panel. A slow, deliberate press, one that I had not made. The elevator did not stop at my floor first. It continued moving upward, as though guided by the unseen presence in the reflection. I shut the monitor off and sat back, trying to convince myself. It was a glitch, a trick of light and shadow, my mind tired from work. But sleep that night eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the flicker of the metal walls and the faint outline of that figure, waiting, patient, in the reflection, watching, never approaching, yet always there. The next morning, I avoided the elevator. I took the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, my mind replaying the reflection over and over. Later, I checked the security feed again. The elevator footage from the previous night remained unchanged. The figure was still there, in the reflection, still moving, still patient. And I knew, as much as I tried to deny it, that it had not been a trick of my mind. It had been there with me the whole time, unseen in the elevator, waiting, reflecting, and perhaps learning. Even now, I hesitate before entering the elevator. I avoid looking directly at the walls, my eyes fixed on the buttons, the handrail, anything to distract myself. And sometimes, when I catch the faint glimmer of metal or the flicker of light in the corner of my eye. I swear I see it again just in the reflection, patient, featureless, unmoving, and yet fully aware. It was one of those evenings where the city felt heavier than usual, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the distant hum of neon signs flickering over rain-slicked streets. I had missed my usual subway train by mere seconds, the doors sliding closed before I could reach them, and I had cursed under my breath, expecting the next one to arrive at least 10 minutes later. The platform was nearly empty, the usual crowd thinned to a handful of commuters, their faces shadowed under the dim lights. I tucked my hands deeper into my coat pockets, listening to the echo of my own footsteps against the tiled floor. The patter of rain still audible through the open sections at the platform's edge. When the next train rolled in, its metallic screech softening as it slowed, I noticed her standing at the edge of the doorway. She was young, maybe in her 20s, wearing a dark coat and holding a small bag at her side. She stepped aside and held the doors open for me, her hand lingering a moment longer than seemed necessary. I nodded in thanks, startled by the gesture. Was polite, but strangely deliberate. She smiled at me then, and that smile was too wide. It stretched unnaturally, the corners pulling back in a way that seemed almost impossible, and her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. I stepped inside, hesitating, but the train had already begun to move, the rumble of the wheels against the tracks reverberating in my chest. The carriage was almost empty, just a few scattered passengers, heads bowed in their phones, or staring out the windows at the blur of dark tunnels. I chose a seat near the middle, glancing back at her. She remained standing, a few steps from the doors, watching me. The smile never faltered. I tried to focus on the passing tunnel, the rhythmic clatter of rails, anything to distract myself. But the unease had already rooted itself deep in my chest. The train lights flickered intermittently, a subtle strobe effect that made shadows leap and twist along the walls. And then I noticed the oddity. When the flicker came, I could see the outline of her shadow stretching across the floor, but it didn't match her stance exactly. It lingered almost as if it had its own life, detaching from her body and shifting subtly toward me. I shifted in my seat, telling myself it was a trick of the lights, the reflection of the overhead lamps, but my pulse raced faster with every flicker. Every so often, I caught the reflection of her smile in the glass of the window beside my seat. It was still too wide, too fixed, as if it were carved into her face. When I blinked, it seemed to stretch a little farther, the teeth sharper in the low light, the eyes holding something patient, almost hungry. My mind tried to reason with itself. Optical illusion, reflection, fatigue, but the feeling of being watched, intensely, unbearably, refused to dissipate. The train stopped briefly at the next station, a usual mid-route pause, and I glanced, expecting her to step aside, to leave the car like any normal passenger. But she didn't. She remained in her place, holding that impossibly wide smile, unmoving, her eyes following my every shift. I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system, the soft whisper of the train moving along its rails, but no other sound seemed to exist. The world inside the carriage had condensed to me and her, and the growing, gnawing sense that something was very wrong. I tried to look away, burying myself in my phone, scrolling without really seeing, hoping that distraction might make her presence feel less suffocating. But in the corner of my vision, I caught glimpses of her again, always standing there, always smiling, the angle of her head ever so slightly tilted toward me. I thought I saw her mouth stretch farther than it should, and the subtle widening of her eyes, just enough to make the human face unnervingly alien. With each station we passed, my anxiety grew. I noticed the other passengers behaving strangely too. They didn't react to her, didn't acknowledge anything unusual. They were like shadows themselves, existing but not seeing, not noticing. It was as though the world beyond her smile had folded away, leaving just me, her, and the endless hum of the train. I tried to convince myself to speak, to ask her if she was all right, but my voice caught in my throat. Something in her presence demanded silence, a quiet that was almost reverent in its intensity. The lights flickered again, and I thought I saw her silhouette detach slightly from the reflection in the window, leaning toward me with a subtle, deliberate grace. My heart pounded, and I gripped the edge of my seat, feeling the metallic coolness of the rail against my fingers, as though anchoring myself in reality. Minutes stretched into something timeless. The flicker, the hum, the shifting shadows formed a slow, hypnotic rhythm that I couldn't escape. And still, she smiled, always too wide, always patient. I wanted to get up, to move, but my legs felt impossibly heavy, tethered to the floor by some unseen weight. The train rattled on, the distant tunnel walls a blur outside the windows, and I realized that the stations were passing more quickly than they should. Or perhaps the train was no longer following the schedule I understood. Eventually, I found myself gripping my bag tightly, deciding to wait until the train reached the end of the line, the last stop, hoping she would finally move on. Dawn. And when the doors opened at that final station, I stepped out cautiously, expecting the crowd of commuters, the familiar sights of lights and signs. But the platform was empty. The air was still thick with that smell of wet asphalt and rain. Yet the city beyond the station was nowhere to be seen. Only the tunnel stretched into darkness behind me, swallowing the sound of the departing train. I turned back instinctively, half expecting to see her standing at the doors, smiling that impossibly wide smile. But the train had gone, empty, silent. I could still feel her presence, though an almost tangible pressure, like a cold wind brushing against the back of my neck. I didn't wait. I ran, my footsteps echoing against the tiled walls, the emptiness pressing against me from every side. Even now, I avoid late trains whenever I can. And sometimes, when I pass a subway entrance, I swear I see her out of the corner of my eye, standing by the doors, her coat dark and indistinct, her smile impossibly wide, her eyes locked on mine, waiting. I tell myself it's my imagination, that it was just the stress of the night, the flickering lights, the shadows, but deep down, I know she's still there, somewhere between reality and the reflection, patient, smiling, and always watching. I had been running late that evening, the kind of lateness that makes the world seem sharper and colder than usual. The subway station I normally avoided was my only option, and I hurried toward the escalator that descended into the depths of the city. The lights overhead flickered slightly, as if struggling to hold back the darkness that seemed to seep from the corners of the station. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and electricity, a metallic temps that made my throat dry. I gripped the railing and stepped onto the moving stairs, expecting the familiar hum of machinery and the gentle rhythm of descent. But immediately, something felt off. The escalator didn't stop where it should have. Normally, it would slow and end after a brief but steady decline, depositing me onto the platform where the subway awaited. But tonight, it seemed to stretch farther, deeper, the bottom hidden in shadows that flickered and danced as if alive. I glanced at the walls, the lights, the tiled sides, but the perspective had changed. What should have been a simple ride down now felt like a journey into an endless corridor of metal and shadow. As I continued to step downward, I noticed the subtle sound first. A faint, distant echo, like water dripping, yet irregular, uneven, and oddly rhythmic. It was almost hypnotic, pulling my attention toward the depths below. I told myself it was just the acoustics, the echo of a large, empty station, but the unease pressed against me, making my hands sweat on the railing. The escalator rumbled beneath me, but the mechanical sound was slower than usual, each movement of the stairs deliberate and heavy, as if the machinery itself were alive and breathing. Minutes or maybe hours seemed to pass. The walls of the escalator tunnel stretched endlessly, flickering under the dim lights, casting shadows that sometimes seemed to move independently, curling in ways that defied geometry. Shit. I felt my pulse accelerate with every shadow that twitched at the edge of my vision, always retreating when I tried to look directly. The escalator continued its descent, and I began to notice a faint chill, a dampness that clung to my coat and hair, seeping from the shadows like invisible mist. Then I heard it, faint murmurs, almost human, echoing up from the depths. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, whispering, patient, coaxing, insistent. It wasn't loud, and yet it filled the space in a way that made silence impossible. I told myself it was imagination, that my mind was conjuring voices from the monotony of the descent. But the whispers felt real, and the longer I rode, the more convinced I became that something below was aware of me. I tried to step off at what I thought might be the bottom, but the escalator simply carried me onward. There was no platform, no station, no familiar tile or signage, only darkness stretching infinitely, punctuated by occasional flickers of light that revealed more shadows, long, thin, and unnaturally still. I gripped the railing tighter, heart hammering, legs trembling. Each flicker made me catch a glimpse of shapes, vague silhouettes, perhaps human, perhaps not, that seemed to watch, to wait, to glide along the walls as if riding alongside me. I began to feel disoriented, the rhythm of the escalator blending with my own breath, my pulse, until time seemed meaningless. The further I descended, the colder it became, the air thick with a dampness that smelled faintly of earth and rust. My shoes squeaked against the moving stairs, the only sound I could control, and I wondered, with a creeping dread, how far this escalator truly went. Was it endless? Was it a descent into something else entirely, a place beyond the station, beyond the city, where light and logic no longer existed? I thought about turning back, climbing against the moving stairs, but the thought of facing the shadows again froze me in place. Every time I looked upward, the escalator stretched impossibly far above, the top lost in a haze of flickering light and darkness, as though the world I had known had been swallowed. And then I realized that I had stopped feeling the motion of the stairs beneath me. The escalator hummed, yes, but the steps themselves seemed to float, carrying me downward through nothingness. Indifferent to my struggle, indifferent to my fear. Whispers grew slightly louder, forming words that teased at my comprehension. I couldn't understand them fully, but the tone suggested knowledge, awareness, a patient waiting. I felt eyes on me, hundreds, perhaps thousands, pressing from the walls, the shadows, the air itself. A creeping sensation ran along my spine, and I imagined faces in the darkness, faces that mirrored my own, staring, smiling, waiting, their expressions twisted just slightly, subtly enough to unsettle but never fully reveal. Time became meaningless. I stopped counting the steps, the flickers, the whispers. The escalator continued, carrying me farther than I could imagine. And then I noticed movement at the edges of my vision. Shapes, fleeting, impossible, sometimes gliding ahead, sometimes following behind. They were human-shaped, but not human, like shadows given substance, waiting for me to descend far enough to join them, or perhaps to claim something from me that I could not name. When I finally glimpsed what I thought might be a bottom, it shifted. Like a mirage, the darkness opened into more darkness, deeper, wider, stretching infinitely in every direction. There was no station, no exit, only the endless hum of machinery and the soft, rhythmic whispering that seemed to pulse with the escalator itself. I realized then, with a sinking dread, that I had passed the point of return. The escalator would carry me forever, and the shapes, the whispers, the shadows, they had been waiting, patient, indifferent, for me to arrive. I don't know how long I've been descending. Minutes, hours, days. Each flicker of light reveals only more shadows, more shapes, more patient, waiting eyes. And sometimes, when I let myself look, I see figures on the escalator steps beside me, impossibly still, faces faintly illuminated by flickering lights, smiling just a little too wide, watching, always watching. Even now, I avoid that station. I never take that escalator, and sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep and I think about the hum and the whispers, I wonder if it is still there, waiting, descending endlessly, calling, patient and eternal. I had always preferred the quiet trams late at night, the ones that ran after the city had dimmed and most people had gone home. That evening, the streets were empty, slick with the sheen of rain that had stopped hours before, leaving puddles that reflected the yellow glow of streetlights. I arrived just as the last tram approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a single, patient eye. I stepped on, clutching my coat tighter around me, the chill of the night pressing through the fabric. The doors closed with a gentle sigh, and the tram began to move, gliding over the wet tracks in a rhythm that was both familiar and oddly off, too slow, too deliberate. The carriage was nearly empty. A few passengers sat scattered, heads bowed or staring out the windows at the blur of dark streets. I chose a seat near the middle, hoping for some semblance of comfort, but something about the atmosphere felt different. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, throwing the faces around me into brief, sharp relief before plunging them back into shadow. For a moment, I thought I caught a reflection of movement that didn't belong to anyone, a shift at the edge of the glass. But when I looked, the windows were still and empty. The tram hummed beneath me, the mechanical rhythm blending with the soft patter of my thoughts. I noticed the subtle strangeness in the way the outside world moved. The familiar streets I had passed countless times on this line seemed distorted, elongated, shadows stretching longer than they should. Buildings warped at the corners of my vision, their windows dark and unwelcoming, doors sealed or non-existent. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue, the trickery of night and rain, yet a small, insistent unease began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. I glanced at the other passengers. They remained quiet, unblinking, but something about them was not right. Their heads tilted in subtle, identical angles, their hands resting unnaturally on their laps, fingers too straight, knuckles too pale. Under the flickering lights, none of them acknowledged me, but I felt their gaze, sharp and focused, piercing through me in a way that made my chest tighten. I looked away, out the window, hoping to find something familiar, but the streets refused to offer comfort. The lamps cast long, stretched shadows across the rain-soaked asphalt, shadows that seemed to twitch and writhe just at the corner of my vision. The tram slowed slightly, as if approaching a stop, but no familiar platform appeared. The city outside became a blur of darkness and distorted light, buildings leaning inward, streets folding over themselves. My stomach churned, and I gripped the edge of my seat, trying to anchor myself to reality. The soft hum of the tram became louder, more insistent, a vibrating tone that seemed almost alive. I realized then that the regular cadence of wheels on tracks had become irregular, uneven, each beat echoing like a heartbeat not my own. I tried to speak, to ask someone if they knew where we were, but my voice caught in my throat. The passengers remained still, unmoving, silent. When I looked back at the driver's cabin, the tram operator was nowhere to be seen, only a faint shadow behind the glass. A chill ran down my spine. I pressed my palm against the window, half expecting to see the city return to some recognizable form, but the darkness beyond was infinite, stretching endlessly with no sign of light or end. Minutes or perhaps hours passed, though I had no sense of time. Every few moments the lights flickered, and in each flicker I caught glimpses of something just beyond the windows, shapes that seemed human but moved in ways that were impossible. They darted from one shadow to another, never fully visible, always watching. And I realized that each time I tried to focus, the shapes shifted, adjusting, patient, waiting for me to notice. The tram's hum began to resonate in my chest, mingling with the whispers I thought I heard beneath it. Low, patient, almost soothing, yet impossible to understand. My heart raced, and I pressed my face to the glass, searching desperately for a platform, a street lamp, a sign, anything to confirm that I was still in the city I knew. But there was nothing, only the darkness, the flickering lights, the subtle, patient movements at the edges of perception. I considered standing, walking toward the front, finding some way to escape. But the tram seemed to elongate the steps between seats, stretching farther than they should. My legs moved sluggishly, my body heavy, as though the air itself had grown viscous. I could hear the faint echo of my own breathing, the whisper of movement from other seats, the soft, shifting hum of the tram, endless and patient. Every window reflected a slightly different version of reality. In one, I saw the familiar streets of my neighborhood, rain-slicked and quiet. In another, the buildings leaned inward, darkened, doors missing, windows black and hollow. In a third, I saw myself sitting in the seat, but the reflection's eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on me with a smile that was too knowing, too patient. My own reflection mimicked nothing I did, yet followed me in perfect synchronization. The whispers grew, almost forming words I could almost understand, teasing at names, places, memories. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the sounds seeped in regardless, soft and insistent. I realized that I could not leave the seat, could not move, could not stop looking out the windows. The tram had become an extension of the darkness outside, carrying me farther than I had ever intended to go, through streets that had no name, over tracks that had no origin. I don't know how long it has gone on, days, hours. It no longer matters. The tram carries me relentlessly, the shadows gliding, alongside, whispering, watching, and sometimes, when I dare to look back at the other passengers, I see them turn their heads, just slightly, their faces faintly illuminated by the flickering lights, smiles to knowing, eyes to patient. I haven't reached a station yet. The city I know seems impossibly far away, as if swallowed by the night, and I fear that I never will. The tram moves on, endless, patient, and I am still aboard, a passenger with no destination, watched by shadows, whispered to by voices I cannot understand, carried forever through darkness that feels alive. I had taken the evening bus many times before, a quiet route that snaked through the older parts of the city. That night, the rain had just stopped, leaving the streets gleaming under the yellow-orange glow of streetlights. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and exhaust, carrying the sort of calm that usually makes a long ride feel reflective, almost comforting. I boarded the bus, the soft hum of its engine blending with the distant dripping of water from awnings and gutters. Few passengers remained at that hour, and I chose a seat halfway back, feeling the familiar comfort of solitude. The bus moved, slowly, stopping at almost empty streets, the occasional street lamp revealing stretches of wet pavement and the occasional shuttered shop. I watched reflections ripple in the puddles as we passed, faint distortions of the world, but something about tonight felt different. The bus was quieter than usual, the normal chatter absent, replaced by a low, constant hum that vibrated faintly in my chest. I adjusted my coat, telling myself it was just fatigued from the long day, yet a small, insistent unease lingered. Somewhere along the ride, a presence shifted beside me. I looked up, startled, and saw a woman standing, a little younger than me. Her hair damp and clinging to her cheeks, eyes bright in the bus's dim light. She wore a simple coat, and despite the chill, she seemed almost radiant, like warmth had condensed around her. Without a word, she gestured toward the seat next. To me, a silent invitation, and then stepped back slightly. My heart skipped an instinctive caution, and yet I found myself nodding and moving over. She smiled softly, that calm, unhurried smile that feels both genuine and somehow unsettling. I glanced at her as she lingered nearby, and noticed the faint shimmer in the air around her, subtle, almost like heat rising from asphalt, but too slow, too deliberate to be natural. I blinked, shook my head, thinking perhaps my eyes were tired, or the bus lights were playing tricks. She offered her hand, a fleeting gesture, as if guiding me to the seat more firmly, yet when I looked again, she was gone. I froze. The seat beside me empty, yet the warmth I had felt persisted, lingering in the space as if she had left an imprint in the air. A ripple passed through the bus, faint, like a sigh. I checked the aisle, the other seats, even peered toward the driver's mirror, but there was no one there. No trace of her at all. And yet, when I turned back, I could feel it like a presence pressing against the edges of my senses, calm and quiet, but undeniably there. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, the fatigue, the hum of the engine blending with the rain, dripping outside, but the hairs on my arms stood up, the subtle vibration of the air around me impossible to ignore. The bus continued its route, but the rhythm felt slightly off. Stops appeared and vanished before I could process them. Streetlights passed too quickly, then too slowly, stretching and compressing the familiar city into something alien. Shadows in the corners of the bus seemed to twitch, bend, and twist, subtle enough that I questioned if I had really seen them. Each flicker of movement was just at the edge of perception, but the instinctive unease pressed harder, growing, settling into the pit of my stomach. I caught my reflection in the window beside me. At first, it was just me, slouched in the seat, a pale face illuminated by passing lights. Then, faintly, the shimmer appeared again, a presence overlapping mine, a shadow, soft, slightly misaligned, mimicking my posture with subtle differences. A tilt too sharp here, a gaze that lingered too long there. I blinked, and the shadow vanished, leaving only my own reflection, but the lingering warmth on the seat reminded me that I had not imagined it. The bus slowed to a stop at a familiar intersection. I expected to see the quiet streets I knew, the old lampposts, the small corner shop, but when I looked, the world beyond the windows had changed. The streets stretched in impossible directions, wet asphalt reflecting shapes I didn't recognize, buildings leaning at strange angles, the familiar geometry of my neighborhood distorted. The lights flickered and warped, casting elongated shadows that darted along the edges of perception just at the corner of my vision. A whisper drifted along the bus, soft, calm, almost affectionate, and yet impossible to place. I leaned forward, straining to hear, to understand, but it melted into the hum of the engine, leaving a residue of tension in its wake. I tried to speak, call for someone, anything, but my throat felt constricted, words trapped in the viscous air. The empty seat beside me seemed to beckon, and I realized with a creeping horror that it had never really been empty. Not entirely. The faint, lingering warmth, the shimmer at the edges of my sight, the subtle pressure in the air, it all suggested she had never truly left, or perhaps she had left in a way that didn't involve leaving at all. The bus continued, the outside world folding into itself, streets becoming tunnels of shadow, lampposts stretching into tall, thin lines of light, reflections in puddles twisting into unrecognizable shapes. I could feel the presence beside me, patient.com, ever present, just beyond full perception. The sense of being watched, accompanied, guided but by something unearthly settled deep into my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look directly at the windows, fearful of what I might see if I did. When the bus finally reached what should have been my stop, the doors opened with the same gentle sigh as before, but the street outside was gone. Nothing I recognized remained. Only darkness, stretching infinitely, punctuated by the subtle shimmer of rain-slicked pavement, reflecting the impossible lights of a city that had no name. I stepped back, heart racing, and the seat beside me remained warm, soft, as if she had never left at all. I haven't taken that route since. I avoid the late buses, the quiet streets, the gentle hum of engines over wet asphalt. And sometimes, when the city is quiet and the air hangs thick with residual rain, I feel the warmth beside me, just for a moment. And I wonder if she ever really disappeared or if she's still there. Patient, waiting, offering a seat that may never truly be empty. I had always taken the same bus route home from work. The one that wound through the quieter neighborhoods, past dimly lit streets and shuttered shops. That evening, the sky had released a steady drizzle, soft and persistent, turning the streets into wet mirrors, reflecting the orange glow of street lamps. I boarded the bus at my usual stop, the doors closing with a gentle sigh behind me. Inside, the warmth of the bus was a small relief from the chill outside, and the hum of the engine settled against my chest, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to soothe me as the vehicle began its familiar route. The passengers were sparse, each sitting silently, some staring blankly out the windows, others engrossed in their phones. I took a seat near the middle, by the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. The rain pattered softly against the glass, creating tiny rivers that twisted and merged in unpredictable patterns. At first, everything seemed ordinary, the familiar route comforting in its routine. But as the bus continued, I noticed a subtle difference. The stops displayed on the overhead monitor, the ones that usually read street names I knew, flickered occasionally, then corrected themselves. A strange prickle of unease brushed the back of my neck. Minutes passed. The bus hummed along, stopping and starting in the usual rhythm, yet the display began to flicker more often. I leaned forward, squinting at the small screen above the driver's head. The familiar names, Maple Street, Oak Avenue, Pine Drive, shifted briefly into something I did not recognize. My heart thumped faster as I saw the letters twist, blur, then snap back into place. I shook my head, attributing it to fatigue, the rain, or the dim flickering of fluorescent lights overhead. But then it happened again. The display changed. And for just a fraction of a second, it read my home address. My actual street, my building number, displayed in crisp, glowing letters as if the bus itself had decided this was its next stop. I froze, eyes wide, my hand gripping the edge of my seat. I looked around quickly. The passengers remained silent, faces neutral, unblinking, yet somehow I felt the weight of their awareness pressing against me. The bus moved smoothly, steadily, as though it had always known this detour, this unnatural destination. I pressed my palm against the window, the cold glass seeping into my skin, trying to ground myself in reality. Outside, the familiar streets had begun to stretch and bend subtly. Buildings leaned inward, their windows dark and hollow. Streetlights flickered, and the reflection of the wet asphalt shimmered unnaturally. My home, the one I had seen countless times, appeared ahead in the darkness, yet distorted. The outline of my building was slightly off, angles too sharp, windows too tall, doors slightly too narrow. I realized with a cold shiver that I had never seen it look like this. The bus slowed, then stopped, and the doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh. The street outside was eerily silent, wet puddles reflecting an impossible glow from somewhere unseen. I noticed that the passengers hadn't moved, hadn't even glanced toward the doors. I looked back at the display. My address remained glowing, static, unwavering. A faint mist seemed to rise from the asphalt, curling upward like smoke, drifting through the empty street toward me. My heart pounded. I wanted to get off, to run, yet my legs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the bus itself had a will of its own. I glanced at the reflection in the window beside me. For a moment, I saw only myself, pale and tense, pressed against the glass. Then, just behind my reflection, a faint shadow shifted, tall and silent, watching. I blinked, and it vanished. Turned to the empty seat across from me, empty, yet still charged with a subtle warmth, as though something had sat there moments before. I could feel it, patient, waiting, lingering. The bus didn't continue forward or backward, it seemed, suspended in place, yet the display remained unwavering, glowing my exact address. I could hear the faintest whisper of movement behind me, soft enough that I could doubt it was real, yet persistent enough that my mind refused to ignore it. The air inside the bus had thickened, carrying a subtle pressure, a silent insistence. That I remain, that I observe, that I feel the presence beside and behind me without seeing it fully. Time lost meaning. Minutes, hours, perhaps something else entirely passed, and the display never changed. Every now and then, a flicker revealed the next stop as something even stranger, rooms I had never entered, hallways I had never walked. The familiar rhythm of the bus became alien, each hum, each vibration of the engine resonating deeper, aligning with the unease that had taken root in my chest. I tried to call out, to demand the driver explain, to turn and run, but the words wouldn't form. My hands gripped the seat tightly, my knuckles white. Outside, the streetlights began to flicker erratically, their reflections elongating in the puddles, shadows dancing in impossible ways. I realized that the bus had become something more than a vehicle. It was a conduit, a bridge between the familiar and the impossible, and I was trapped within it, watched and guided by something unseen. Eventually, the street beyond the doors seemed to blur, folding into itself. The outlines of my home, the one I recognized, became indistinct, warped. The rain, still softly falling, glimmered on surfaces that shouldn't exist, and the quiet hum of the bus became a low, vibrating tone, almost like a heartbeat, slow and insistent. Still, the display above glowed, unwavering my address, exact, impossible. I haven't taken that bus since I avoid late rides, quiet streets, the soft hum of engines over wet asphalt. And yet, sometimes, when I walk past a familiar street, or hear the faint patter of rain on the pavement, I feel the subtle pull of a bus that knows exactly where I live, waiting silently, patient, its doors open, offering a ride I cannot refuse, to a destination that perhaps no longer exists in the world I know.